The morning Nora Holden walked into Carver's diner, she was wearing the same leather jacket she had worn for 26 years. It was black once. Now it was the color of old charcoal, soft in the way that only decades of use can make leather soft, broken in at every crease and fold until it moved with her body the way a second skin moves. The patches on it were faded at the edges, some of them cracked along the stitching, and if you knew what you were looking at, each one told you something. If you did not know what you were looking at, you might have thought she was just an old woman in an old coat. That was fine with Nora. It had always been fine with her. She took the corner booth by the window, the one she always took when she came in on Thursday mornings. Frank Carver, who had owned this diner for 19 years and who had known Nora Holden for most of them, brought her coffee without being asked. Black, no sugar. He set it down in front of her, and she wrapped both hands around the mug, the way she always did, even in summer, because her hands had been cold for as long as she could remember, and hot ceramic helped. Outside, Millhaven moved through its Thursday the way a small Tennessee town moves through most of its days. Deliberately, without hurry. The hardware store across the street had its door propped open. Two men in work boots stood talking outside the barber shop. A woman walked her dog past the post office, and the dog stopped to investigate something in the grass, and the woman waited with the patience of someone who has learned that waiting is not the same as wasting time. Nora watched all of it through the glass. She had been watching this street for 30 years, first from this window, and before that from the sidewalk, and before that from the back of Hank's bike, when they used to come through town together on Sunday afternoons, just to see it. She had lived in Millhaven her whole adult life. She knew the name of every business on this block, and the name of the family behind it, and usually the name of the grandmother who had started the thing, or the uncle who had nearly run it into the ground before someone steadier took over. A town like this is not just buildings and streets. It is accumulated story, and Nora Holden had been reading that story for a very long time. She was 69 years old. She had gray hair that she kept short and a face that had spent a lot of time outdoors and showed it. Not in a damaged way, in the way of someone who has been present for her life rather than protected from it. Her eyes were a particular shade of brown that sometimes looked almost green in morning light, and they were still and watchful in the manner of someone who has learned that most of what you need to know about a situation can be gathered by watching rather than asking. Her husband Hank had been gone 4 years. Hank Holden, president of Iron Valley MC for 17 years, one of the most respected men in 3 states, among people who measured respect by what a man actually did rather than what he wore or drove or claimed. He had died on a Tuesday in October, a heart attack that came fast and without ceremony, and Nora had been the one who found him, and the one who called, and the one who sat in the hospital waiting room alone because she had not yet reached anyone on the phone. And by the time the first of their people arrived, it was already over. She had buried him on a Friday. She had been getting up every morning since without him, which is the kind of thing that sounds simple and is not. She took a sip of her coffee. She unfolded the newspaper she had brought from home and set it on the table in front of her. She was not really reading it. She was thinking about the meeting she had scheduled for the afternoon. A quiet conversation with Reed Armstrong, the county sheriff, that had been 3 weeks in the planning and that she hoped would be the last of the planning and the beginning of the doing. But she had time. It was not yet 9 in the morning. Brenda, who had worked the morning shift at Carver's since before Frank had repainted the walls, came by to refill Nora's coffee and said something about the weather, and Nora agreed about the weather, and Brenda moved on. This was a routine comfortable enough that neither of them had to think about it. It was the kind of small, regular warmth that holds a life together at the edges, and Nora had learned to value it more than she once had. The bell above the door rang at 20 minutes past 9. Nora did not look up immediately. She had learned over many years and in many kinds of rooms not to look up at every sound. You observe when it means something. You wait until it does. But Brenda looked up, and the way Brenda's expression shifted from the ordinary, pleasant blankness of a woman going through a familiar morning to something tighter and more careful was enough to make Nora raise her eyes from her newspaper. Paul Dalton came through the door first. He was 55 years old, medium height, broad through the shoulders in the way of a man who had once been athletic and was now simply large. He wore clothes that were casual in the way that expensive clothes perform casualness. Khaki trousers and a collared shirt in a pale blue that someone had picked for him. His hair was silver at the temples, and he wore it slightly long, the hair of a man who considers himself distinguished rather than aging. He held himself with the certainty of someone who has moved through most rooms in his life without anyone telling him to move differently. Behind him came Sandra Dalton. She was in her early 50s, thin, in the deliberate way that takes time and attention to maintain. She wore a silk blouse and dark pants, and shoes that had no business being worn in a diner in a small Tennessee town. Her sunglasses were still on her face, indoors. She looked at the room the way a person looks at a room when they have already decided what they think of it and are simply confirming the judgment. The Daltons had property 15 miles outside Millhaven. They had been coming through town for going on 3 years since Paul had quietly acquired that property and begun the first stages of a development project that had, in the way of development projects, grown considerably in scope since its beginning. What started as a conversation about a boutique resort had become in whispered conversations at the hardware store and the diner counter and the parking lots of the Methodist and Baptist churches, something much larger. Something that required land, a lot of land that currently belonged to people who had farmed it or raised their families on it for generations, and who had begun receiving visits from men in those same expensive casual clothes, carrying papers, and speaking in the particular register of people who are explaining to you why what you have is worth less than you think. The town had a word for the Daltons, though it was not usually said directly. The word was trouble. And it was the kind of trouble that wears good shoes and knows lawyers. People remembered things. They remembered the way Sandra had spoken to the girl at the pharmacy counter, a 22-year-old named Debbie, who had a stutter and who Sandra had publicly imitated. They remembered the lawsuit Paul had filed against Gerald Weaver, 63 years old, over a property boundary dispute involving 4 inches of land and a fence post. 4 inches. Gerald had eventually prevailed, but the legal fees had taken 3 months of savings he had not had to spare. They remembered the way Paul had pressured the elderly couple on Ridgeline Road, the Fosters, 81 and 79 years old, showing up unannounced 3 times in a single week until the old man had driven to the sheriff's office himself because he did not know what else to do. None of these things had resulted in any consequence for the Daltons. That was part of what made them dangerous. Consequence requires someone to impose it, and the Daltons understood in the way that some people understand early and deeply that consequence is rarely imposed on those who project enough confidence about their right to exist without it. Paul Dalton scanned the diner. 3 booths along the window side were empty. 2 tables in the center of the room were open. He saw all of this. Then he saw Nora Holden in the corner booth. Something moved across his face. Nora saw it. She had seen that look before, in other faces, in other rooms, across a span of decades, and she knew what it meant. It was the look of a person who has just decided something. Not an angry decision. Something more calculated than that. Something almost like amusement, the way a cat looks at something smaller than itself. Paul said something to Sandra in a voice too low for Nora to hear. Sandra looked at the corner booth. She smiled the kind of smile that is not meant to be pleasant. They walked past the 3 empty booths. They walked past the 2 open tables. They settled into the booth directly beside Nora Holden, close enough that Paul's elbow was 6 inches from her newspaper, and arranged themselves with the ease of people who have done this kind of thing before. Brenda appeared at their table with menus. Her movements were precise and without warmth, the practiced neutrality of someone who serves everyone equally, regardless of how she feels about them. Because that is the job, and because Frank Carver ran a place where everyone was served. Sandra did not take the menu. She said without looking at Brenda that she would have a sparkling water if such a thing existed in this establishment. Paul ordered coffee black in the way he said everything, as though the words were doing him a small favor by being spoken at all. Brenda took the menus back and moved away. The diner continued around them, forks on plates, a low conversation from the back, the radio behind the counter playing something from the early 90s. Sandra's voice when it began was quiet enough that only the nearest people would catch it clearly. That was by design. It was not the volume of someone who had lost control. It was the volume of someone who wanted a specific audience. She said something to Paul about the decor, about a certain rustic quality that she supposed some people found charming. Paul agreed in a way that required no words beyond a soft sound in his throat. Sandra then said something about the smell of old fryer grease and how it was the kind of smell that got into things, into clothes especially, and how you could always tell when someone had spent too much time in places like this because they carried it with them. Paul smiled. Then louder, Sandra turned slightly and looked at Nora's leather jacket. Not at Nora, at the jacket. The way you look at an object you are evaluating rather than a person you are addressing. Nice Halloween costume, she said. Nora did not look up from her newspaper. That's vintage, isn't it? Sandra said to Paul. From about 1987 or so. Earlier, Paul said, you'd think she'd have outgrown it by now. Nora turned a page. Her hands were steady. The patches are interesting, Sandra said louder now, conversationally performing interest she did not have. What do they mean? Is there a manual? A decoder ring? Two people at the counter had stopped eating. Frank Carver had come to the pass-through window between the kitchen and the front of the house and was standing there with a dish towel in his hands and an expression that was very carefully controlled. Paul leaned forward slightly. Hey, his voice had shifted from performed amusement to something with more edge in it. You're being talked to. Nora took a slow sip of her coffee. Maybe she can't hear, Sandra said. That happens at a certain age. Or maybe she's just rude, Paul said. Nora set her mug down. She folded her newspaper with deliberate care, the same way she had been folding newspapers her whole life. Corner to corner, the spine aligned. She set it flat on the table beside her mug, and then she sat back and looked at them. Not at Paul, not at Sandra. She looked at both of them, one and then the other, with the dark, still eyes of someone who has been in rooms considerably more dangerous than this one, and has long since stopped letting rooms choose the pace for her. She said nothing. She simply looked. Sandra held the look for a moment and then glanced away, which was not a thing Sandra Dalton was accustomed to doing. Paul straightened his spine. His jaw shifted slightly. You got a problem, he said. Nora returned her gaze to the window. Outside, the hardware store owner was signing for a delivery. A truck idled at the curb. The morning continued. Paul Dalton did not like being dismissed. He had built a considerable portion of his identity on the certainty that he was not the kind of man who got dismissed. And every interaction in his life had, through a combination of money and aggression and the careful selection of people less powerful than himself to push against, confirmed this. He looked at Sandra. She gave him the smallest nod. Permission or encouragement, or simply the shared understanding of two people who have done this before and know how the next part goes. Paul reached for the glass of iced tea that Brenda had brought him. He picked it up slowly, and then he stood, and he stepped a single step to Nora's booth, and he turned the glass over directly above her head. The ice water ran down over the gray hair and down the leather jacket and dripped from the table edge onto the linoleum. It was cold. It was startling. It was intended to humiliate. The woman at the next table put her hand over her mouth. Brenda went completely still. A man at the counter said something under his breath that he did not say out loud. Paul Dalton set the empty glass down on Nora's table with a small, precise click. He looked at her with the expression of someone who has just made a point and is waiting for the acknowledgement. Nora did not move for a long moment. The water dripped from the hem of her jacket onto the seat. The ice had scattered across the table, and some of it had landed in her lap. Then slowly, with the economy of movement of someone who is not performing her own steadiness, but simply demonstrating it, she reached for a napkin. She wiped her face. She patted the jacket. She set the napkin down. She looked at the ice on the table for a moment, as though considering it philosophically. Then she looked up at Paul Dalton, and she spoke 7 words in a voice that was quiet and even, and completely without drama. "I was hoping you'd show yourself." Nobody moved. The ceiling fan turned. The radio played. Paul Dalton blinked. His expression shifted through several things, quickly. Confusion first, then recalculation. Then the beginning of something that might have been the first edge of actual unease, though he would not have named it that. He had expected anger. He had expected raised voices, or silence, or the particular shrinking quality of someone who has been made to feel small. He had not expected those 7 words, and he had not expected the tone in which they were delivered, which was the tone of someone who has been waiting for a thing to confirm itself and has now had it confirmed. He opened his mouth. He closed it. Nora reached into the inside pocket of her jacket and took out her phone. She sent a text that took about 4 seconds. Then she put the phone away and folded her hands on the table and waited. Sandra looked at Paul. The amusement had left her face. To understand what those 7 words meant and what Nora Holden was doing in that diner on that Thursday morning, you have to go back. Not just 4 years to the loss of Hank, though that matters. Further back than that, Nora grew up in Harlan County, Kentucky, the youngest of 4 children, in a household where money was a constant presence, mainly through its absence. Her father worked at the mine until the mine stopped being a thing worth working at, and then he worked at whatever presented itself. Her mother kept a garden that was not decorative. You understand the difference between a garden as an expression of preference and a garden as a material fact of survival. Nora understood it from childhood. She was a serious girl who became a serious woman. Not humorless, serious in the sense of someone who pays attention to what is real, rather than what is convenient to believe. She married Hank Holden at 23, which some people thought was too young, but what they did not understand was that Nora at 23 was more certain of her judgment than most people are at 50. She had been reading people accurately since she was old enough to understand that faces and words do not always carry the same message. And Hank Holden was, in her estimation, and in the estimation of nearly everyone who knew him, a man whose face and words were the same thing. Iron Valley MC was not what the movies suggest, or not entirely. It was a brotherhood genuinely built on the kind of code that asks real things of the people who hold to it. Loyalty, honesty, showing up, being the person who comes when you call at 2 in the morning and who does not require an explanation before they get in the truck. Nora had not been peripheral to that life. She had been inside it, had ridden beside. Hank had sat in the long planning conversations and the harder arguments and the occasional real danger, and had learned through all of it something about what it means to be genuinely accountable to other people. Over 30 years in Millhaven, the things Nora Holden had done for the people of that town had accumulated quietly, the way sediment accumulates slowly and without announcement, until one day you look at what has been built and the sheer weight of it surprises you. She had paid Robert Monroe's surgery bills. Robert was 71 years old, a Korean War veteran who walked with a cane and wore the same VFW cap every day, and who had been told by the VA that his knee replacement was not being approved in the current budget cycle, which meant another year or more of the kind of pain that changes the quality of every moment. Nora had heard about it through a mutual acquaintance, not from Robert himself, because Robert was the kind of man who did not ask. 3 days after she heard there was a certified check in Robert's mailbox from an account he did not recognize, covering the full cost of both surgeries. He had called around quietly to figure out where it had come from. He had eventually figured it out. He had never said anything publicly about it because Nora had asked him not to. She had helped Carolyn keep her bakery. Carolyn Weiss had run the best bakery in Millhaven for 22 years, first with her husband, and then after his death, alone. Her landlord, who had properties across 4 counties, and the casual cruelty of someone who has never had to worry about money, had raised her rent by 60% in a single month. an amount designed to force a sale. Carolyn could not afford a lawyer. She had been 3 weeks from closing when Nora heard. Nora did not file a lawsuit. She paid a visit. Alone in her jacket on a Tuesday afternoon to the landlord's office, 3 towns over. Nobody knew what was said in that office. What was known was that Carolyn received a certified letter 4 days later restoring her original rent, and that her landlord in the years since had not spoken to Carolyn Weiss at all. Not out of hostility, but with the elaborate care of someone who would very much prefer not to. She had given Knox Dixon a chance. Knox was 26, now compact and steady, and the kind of quiet that comes from having learned something. He had been 19 when he made the mistake that cost him 2 years and a record, and made him for a stretch of time after his release, the kind of person that most employers in small towns don't return calls to. Nora had met him through a family connection, had brought him into the shop she and Hank had run together on the edge of town, had taught him engines with the same patient thoroughness with which she had taught herself. He had 3 employees now, and a reputation for doing work right the first time. He was not where he was without her. She had never announced any of this. She had never accepted public credit for any of it. She did these things because the people needed them done, and because Hank had believed and she believed that your community is not a backdrop to your life. It is a living thing that requires tending. And 5 months ago, she had begun watching the Daltons. The first time she heard the name was from an older couple named Foster, who farmed their land out on Ridgeline Road, had farmed it for 40 years, and who had received 3 unannounced visits in a single week from men carrying paperwork and asking questions and suggesting with that particular layered kind of pressure that is technically not a threat, that the Fosters consider the generosity of the offer being extended. Nora had gone out to their house. She had listened. She had said almost nothing. She had driven home and sat at the kitchen table where she and Hank had sat for so many years, and she had taken out a new notebook and written the name Paul Dalton at the top of the first page. Over the next 5 months, she had gathered what could be gathered by a patient woman who did not draw attention to herself, and who had, over the course of a long life, learned to be still in rooms where information moved. She collected names. She collected dates. She photographed documents when she had access to them. She spoke to 11 families. 11 families who had received visits, who had been pressured, who had in several cases been handed paperwork that did not accurately represent their legal rights. Paperwork that had been written to obscure rather than clarify, and who had, in 3 cases, already signed things they did not fully understand. Paul Dalton's development project required land. It required specifically a contiguous corridor of land along the eastern edge of Millhaven County, and the fastest way to assemble that corridor was to acquire the small holdings one by one, preferably before any of the individual owners understood what the whole picture looked like. That was the design. You did not tell the Fosters that their land was adjacent to 8 other pieces being assembled. You told them only about their piece in isolation, and you framed the offer in the language of their own benefit. Nora had put all of this in the notebook, and she had made copies of every document she had collected. And 3 weeks ago, she had called Reed Armstrong and told him she had something she needed to show him. The meeting had been scheduled for that afternoon. In the small conference room at the back of the county sheriff's office at 2 o'clock, with Reed and 2 people from the state attorney general's office, who had been quietly working their own parallel thread on Paul Dalton's activities in 2 other counties. Nora had not needed to come to Carver's Diner that morning. She could have stayed home, done some work in the garden, driven to her meeting in the afternoon. But she came to Carver's on Thursday mornings. She had been doing it for years. She was not going to stop doing it because the Daltons had acquired property nearby and occasionally came through town. She had known in the way that someone with a long history of reading people knows that a confrontation with the Daltons was likely eventually. She had not arranged it. She had not engineered it. But she had understood that people who move through the world the way the Daltons move through it, who choose the weakest person in a room for their entertainment, who cannot pass an undefended target without engaging it, were very likely at some point to choose her. She had simply decided if that happened, she was not going to pretend to be someone who was surprised. Paul Dalton was standing in front of her with an empty glass and an expression beginning to shift from confidence to something more complicated. And Nora was sitting with her folded hands on a table with ice water on it, and she had sent her text, and now she was waiting. The diner was very quiet. Frank Carver came out from the kitchen. He stood at the counter and looked at the ice on Nora's table, and at Paul Dalton standing over her, and at the look on Nora's face, which was not angry, and was not afraid, and was not anything that required rescue. He had known Nora Holden for almost 20 years. He knew looking at her face that she had this. He still stood between them and the door, because some things are about principle. Brenda had moved to the far end of the counter. She was gripping the coffee carafe with both hands and watching the Daltons with the expression of someone who has been in this town long enough to understand what they were watching, even if they could not yet have told you exactly how it was going to play out. Paul Dalton turned back to Sandra. She had risen slightly in her seat, leaning forward, her sunglasses still on, her composure intact, on the surface in the way of someone who has long practiced keeping composure on surfaces. But her jaw was set in a way that it had not been set before Nora spoke. Those 7 words had done something that an angry response would not have done. They had suggested that Nora Holden had information. They had suggested that she had been watching and waiting. They had introduced the possibility, still too vague to fully hold, but impossible to dismiss, that the woman in the old leather jacket was not the target of this conversation, but the one who had been conducting it. Paul said, his voice finding a new register, a smoother one. "Look, there's no need for any unpleasantness." Nora looked at him with the same still expression. "We got off on the wrong foot," he said. Sandra said, "We were just having a conversation." Nora said nothing. "I'm sure we can talk about this," Sandra said. "If there's some kind of issue, we can certainly discuss compensation or—" She gestured in a vague way that was meant to indicate generosity. Nora looked at her for a moment and then looked away back toward the window, as though the conversation had concluded in a way she had anticipated. The door opened. Robert Monroe came in. He was 71 years old, and he walked with a cane, and he wore his green work pants and his plaid flannel shirt and his VFW cap the way he wore them every day of his life. He had been the first person Nora called that morning, not to arrange anything in advance, just to let him know she was going to be at Carver's, and that the Daltons had been seen in the area. Robert had said he might stop by for a late coffee. He looked at the diner. He looked at the ice water situation. He looked at Nora's face, reading it the way a man reads the face of someone he has known for many years. Then he crossed to the counter, pulled out a stool, and sat down. "Morning, Frank," he said. "Morning, Robert," Frank said. Robert accepted his coffee. He wrapped both hands around it, same as Nora did. He did not look at the Daltons. Then after a moment, he turned on his stool and addressed the room in the unhurried voice of a man who has decided to say something and is going to say it at his own pace. "Most people in this town know me," he said. "Those who don't, I'm Robert Monroe. I'm a veteran. I farmed the Birchwood parcel for 23 years before my knees went. The VA wasn't covering my surgeries, both knees. I was looking at another couple of years barely able to walk, maybe more." He took a sip of his coffee. "Nora Holden found out about it. I never told her directly. Word gets around between neighbors, and it got around to her. 3 days after she heard, there was an envelope in my mailbox. No name on the return address, but I knew. People who know Nora knew." He paused. "I've had 2 good years since those surgeries. I've been able to do things I hadn't been able to do in a long time. Walk my property, help my neighbor move equipment, stand at my wife's grave without needing to sit down after 10 minutes. He set his mug down. That's who poured cold water on. The diner was very still. Paul Dalton opened his mouth and then did not say what he had been going to say. Sandra's hands were flat on the table. The expression on her face had undergone a genuine change, not in the surface smoothness that was still intact, but in the eyes. Something behind the eyes had shifted, Brenda said from where she was standing at the counter and quietly and without drama. 3 years ago, my mother's bakery was going to close. 22 years on the same block. Her landlord raised the rent to push her out. We couldn't afford a lawyer. We couldn't afford to fight it. She looked at her hands. Nora went and saw him. I don't know what she said. None of us do. The rent came back down. We've never had a problem since. She looked up. She didn't ask for anything. Not once. From the booth by the far wall, Knox Dixon put his fork down. He was 26, compact with the steady hands of someone who works with machinery, and the contained quality of someone who has been through things and come out the other side careful rather than bitter. He said, I had a conviction at 19. I was 21 when I got out and I couldn't get a call back for 6 months. Nora brought me on, taught me everything, told me the only thing the past should do is teach you, not define you. He looked at his plate for a moment. I have my own shop now, 3 employees. That doesn't exist without her. The ceiling fan turned. The radio played. Paul Dalton looked at Sandra. In the economy of their long and practiced partnership in cruelty, they had many small signals for one another. A look, a tilt of the head, the quality of a particular silence. What passed between them now was something different from all of those. It was the recognition still forming, still being resisted, that something had gone wrong in a way that was not fixable through the usual means. The door opened again. This time it was Reed Armstrong, the county sheriff. He was lean and in his mid-50s and had been sheriff of this county for 11 years. He came in with the easy movement of a man entirely at home in the rooms of his jurisdiction, and he went to the counter and nodded to Frank, who had Brenda pour him a coffee without being asked, and he stood at the counter and drank it for a moment before turning to address the room in the particular way of a man who is about to say something official, but has chosen to do it standing at a counter rather than from a position of formal authority. Because the informal register sometimes lands better. Morning, Reed said. Several people said, morning back. Reed looked at Paul Dalton. I was hoping to run into you, he said. We've been collecting reports for about 7 months now. Harassment complaints, public disturbance, 2 civil cases settled quietly in Granger County, a property fraud complaint in Callaway that's got 4 witnesses willing to go on record. He let that land. We've been patient because patience lets cases build. But I want you to understand that what happens in this diner this morning, including whatever happened to that table over there with the ice on it, is recorded. Frank keeps cameras. Paul looked up at the camera above the register. He had not noticed it before. It was small and placed high, and it had the wide-angle lens of something installed by someone who thought about coverage rather than aesthetics. You're both welcome to call your attorney, Reed said. Nobody's stopping you. Sandra said, this is harassment. You're welcome to file that complaint, Reed said. I'll be happy to take it in person. Nora had not looked at Reed. She was watching the Daltons with the patient quality of someone in the final stages of a long wait. She reached into the inside breast pocket of her jacket and removed a manila envelope. It was not thick, but it was not thin. She set it on the table beside the folded newspaper and the coffee mug. This is a copy, she said. The originals are already with the sheriff's office and the state attorney general. 11 families, names, dates, documentation, and copies of the paperwork you had them sign, annotated by a property rights attorney to show exactly where the language was designed to mislead rather than inform. Paul looked at the envelope. His face had gone through several things and had arrived at a stillness that was not the deliberate stillness of someone in control, but the stillness of someone who has run out of moves. 5 months, Nora said. Patient work, a lot of driving, a lot of conversations with people who were scared and who needed someone to listen before they were able to tell their stories. She paused. None of them wanted trouble. They just wanted to keep what was theirs. Sandra's composure, the surface of it was still intact. But she was sitting very straight, and her hands, which had been flat on the table, had come together in her lap where they were not visible. You poured cold water on my head, Nora said to Paul. She said it in the same, even, undramatic voice she had been using throughout. That's going to dry. Everything else. She tapped the envelope once with one finger. That's going to take considerably longer. She picked up her coffee and took a sip and looked out the window. Outside Millhaven continued its Thursday. The hardware store delivery truck had pulled away from the curb. The barber shop was doing a steady business. A woman with a stroller was navigating the sidewalk outside the post office with the focused competence of someone who has gotten good at a thing through repetition. The bell above the door rang again, and then several times in quick succession as more people came in. Dorothy Haverford, who was 73 and who had been the Daltons' first real target in Millhaven before she had somehow found the courage to say no. Gerald Weaver, who had spent 3 months' savings defending 4 inches of fence line. The woman who had been the pharmacy cashier 19, now working her way through community college, still carrying something tight in her face when she looked at the Daltons that had not been there before she was 19. They came in without drama. They sat down, they ordered coffee, or they did not order anything. They were simply present. They were the stories. Every one of them was a page in the documentation that was already sitting in the manila envelope on Nora's table, and in the files at the county sheriff's office. Paul Dalton looked at the room. He looked at the faces. He was doing the kind of calculation that men like Paul Dalton do when the numbers have changed, a rapid reassessment, a search for the angle that still works. He did not find one. Sandra said nothing. She was looking at Nora with an expression that was working very hard to remain unreadable and was not entirely succeeding. There was something in it that Nora recognized, the very first faint beginning of a kind of reckoning. Not regret, not yet. Regret takes longer. But the precursor to regret, the moment when a person begins to understand that what they have done has a real shape in the world, and that the shape is visible to others. Nora looked at her once, and then looked away. She did not need anything from Sandra Dalton's face. Reed Armstrong finished his coffee. He set the mug down on the counter with care. He said to Paul, "I'd advise you to consult with your attorney today. There are going to be some conversations you'll want to be prepared for." He nodded to Frank. He nodded to Nora, a small nod that carried the weight of their long mutual history. Not simple and not uncomplicated, but built on something real. Then he left. The diner began to breathe again. Not loudly, not with celebration, just with the restored normalcy of a space that had been held in suspension and was now settling back. People went back to their plates. Brenda refilled coffees. Frank disappeared back into the kitchen, and the sounds of the kitchen resumed. Nora finished her coffee. She folded her newspaper with the same corner-to-corner care with which she had folded it earlier. She gathered the manila envelope and tucked it back into her jacket. She left the exact amount of cash for her bill on the table, plus a tip she had been leaving Brenda for 11 years. She stood. She buttoned her jacket, smoothing the front panel over the patches. And then she looked at Paul and Sandra Dalton one last time. Not with anger, not with satisfaction, with the specific quality of a woman who has done the thing that needed doing and has nothing further to say. "I grew up in Harlan County," she said. "Where I come from, people take care of their neighbors, or they don't have neighbors worth taking care of." She settled her jacket. "This is my town. These are my people." She looked at the room. "This has always been my town." She walked out of the diner and into the Thursday morning, into the Millhaven street she had known for 30 years. And the bell above the door rang behind her. Inside the diner held its silence for a moment. Then Robert Monroe said something quietly to Frank, and Frank said something back, and Brenda refilled someone's coffee, and the ceiling fan turned, and the radio played, and the particular ordinary morning resumed, carrying with it, as ordinary mornings sometimes do, something that was not at all ordinary at its center. And outside in the parking lot, Nora Holden stood beside her truck for a long moment and looked up at the sky. The morning was clear. The air smelled of cut grass and the distant, particular sweetness of the bakery down the block that Carolyn had kept open for 22 years. She thought about Hank. She always did in moments like this. He would have been pleased, she thought, not at the confrontation. Hank had never taken pleasure in confrontation for its own sake, but at the outcome, at the 11 families, at the notebook now translated into something with legal weight and a future. At the fact that the people of Millhaven had stood up, had found their voices, had walked into that diner one by one and said their piece. She took out her phone. There were 3 messages, 2 from Vance Briggs, who was the president of Iron Valley MC, and who had been one of the first calls she'd made 5 months ago when she started this work. One from her daughter in Nashville, who asked how she was doing. She sent Vance a short text. Then she got in her truck and drove. Behind her in the diner, the Daltons sat in the silence they had made and had not anticipated, and the room moved around them with the steady indifference of a community that has been present for its own story and knows exactly what chapter this is. She drove the long way back through town the way she sometimes did when she needed the motion in the familiar street to do what familiar streets do when you have lived somewhere long enough, which is to ground you. Past the Methodist church where she and Hank had attended on occasion, not from deep doctrine, but from the understanding that community requires showing up in the places where community gathers. Past the VFW hall that had been re-roofed 3 years ago, with lumber and labor that had arrived on a Tuesday morning without anyone calling ahead, Vance and 11 others from the chapter, tools in the back of a truck, not announcing themselves. Past the lot where the youth center had been built, a modest building, not impressive from the outside, but the kind of place that had kept certain young men and women from making certain decisions that would have been very difficult to undo, because there was somewhere to be in the evenings and someone who asked how they were doing and meant it. She had been part of all of this, not the center of it. Hank had always been the center, the gravitational thing around which Iron Valley organized itself. The man whose presence calibrated the room. She had been beside him, which was where she had always been by choice, because she understood something about partnership that people who have not experienced a good one sometimes miss, which is that beside is not lesser than. It is its own orientation, with its own kind of weight. After he died, some people had expected her to step back, had expected perhaps that the community work, the quiet assistance, the long, patient effort to hold things together would diminish without him. She had understood the expectation, and she had not been angry about it because it was based on an honest misreading, on the assumption that she had done these things because of Hank rather than alongside him. She let the expectation exist, and she got up every morning and she did the work. In over 4 years, the expectation had quietly dissolved, the way most misreadings dissolve when the evidence accumulates long enough. The Dalton situation had required more than the usual work. Not because it was more complicated emotionally, she had made peace with complicated a long time ago, but because it required a kind of sustained, tactical patience that was tiring in a specific way. You cannot rush documentation. You cannot push people to trust you faster than they are ready to trust. You sit with them. You listen as long as it takes. You drive out to Ridgeline Road at 7 in the evening when the Fosters are finally ready to talk, and you sit in their kitchen and drink the coffee they make, and you do not look at your watch. The notebook had grown slowly, page after page, over 5 months, and there were things in it that had made her angry, in the deep, quiet way that she reserved for things that mattered not hot and consuming, but cold and purposeful. The kind of anger that does not burn out, the kind that becomes fuel. She pulled into her driveway. The house was the same house she had lived in with Hank for 27 years. A farmhouse set back from a county road with a barn that was no longer a barn, but a large workshop and a garden that was not decorative. The truck she drove was old, practical, reliable, the kind of truck you buy when you need something to work rather than to impress. On the back of the cab, barely visible unless you were looking for it, was a small Iron Valley MC decal, faded to near transparency. She had put it there in 1994. She had never taken it off. She went inside. She made a fresh pot of coffee and stood at the kitchen window while it brewed. The garden outside was in its June fullness. Tomatoes coming up along the stakes she had put in 3 weeks ago. The bean rows clean and straight. The herb bed along the south side smelling of things she had planted and tended and would use through the fall. The peony Hank had brought her from a nursery outside Knoxville in their first year in this house. Old now, its roots deep, blooming every June in the exact shade of deep rose it had always been. She poured her coffee. She carried it to the kitchen table. She sat in the chair that had always been her chair, which was not the chair at the head of the table, because she had never needed to sit at the head of the table in her own kitchen to know who she was in her own kitchen. She opened the new notebook she had started 2 days ago, blank pages beyond the first few, and she made some notes. Things to follow up on with Reed. A name she had not yet reached, a woman out on Pine Creek Road who had been visited twice by Dalton's people and had not yet returned her calls. Details to prepare for the meeting this afternoon. She worked for an hour. Then she put the notebook away and went out to the garden and spent another hour doing what the garden required, which was attending to it on its own terms, without rushing, because growing things have their own schedule and do not negotiate. At 1:15, she changed into clean clothes, put the jacket back on, took the original notebook and the documentation folder from the filing cabinet in the spare bedroom where she kept things that mattered, and drove to the county sheriff's office. Reed Armstrong was at his desk when she came in. He was alone. He had sent his deputy out on an errand because what they were about to discuss was going to move to an official track soon enough, but was not yet official. And Reed was the kind of man who understood the difference between the moment before something becomes formal and the moment after, and treated both with the appropriate care. He looked at her for a moment when she came in and said, "I heard about this morning." "Word moves fast," Nora said. "It's a small town." He looked at the folder she was carrying. "Is that what I think it is?" She sat down across from him and opened the folder on his desk. She walked him through it. It took 40 minutes. When she finished, Reed sat back in his chair and was quiet for a long time. Not the silence of someone at a loss, but the silence of a man working through implications methodically. "The AG's people are going to want to see all of this," he said. "I know. The copies I've been sending over the last 2 weeks should give them the structure. This is the original documentation. You've been carrying this around for 5 months." "I've been building it for 5 months," Nora said. "Carrying it is just logistics." He looked at her. There was something in his face that was not quite any one simple thing. Not admiration exactly, though there was an element of that. More like the expression of someone who is looking at a thing that has been done the right way and recognizing it as such. He had known Nora Holden for a long time. He had not always agreed with her. There had been moments over the years, specific situations where their respective positions, the woman inside the biker community and the man who wore the county's badge, had put them on opposite sides of a line, and they had navigated those moments with the careful, mutual honesty of people who respect each other enough to be direct about disagreement. That history was part of why she had brought the documentation to him rather than to someone else. She knew who he was. He knew who she was. There was no confusion between them about what either of them stood for. "The Fosters," he said. "How are they doing?" "Scared, but they're willing to make a statement. All 11 families are now. It took time. People needed to know they wouldn't be standing alone." He nodded. He looked at the documentation again. Then he looked up. "There's something else you should know," he said. "Something I was planning to tell you at this meeting anyway." He paused. "The tribute, the one Vance and the chapter have been organizing." Nora was still. "Frank Carver 3 months ago," Reed said. "He had been talking to Vance. They wanted to do it right, wanted it to be the town, not just the chapter. They asked me to be part of the planning." He looked at her steadily. "It's tonight, Nora, 7 o'clock, at the diner. Frank's been setting it up in the back room since early morning." She looked at him for a long moment. "Everyone's coming," he said. "Everyone whose life you've touched. Veterans, families, former kids from the mentorship program, people you helped, and people you helped those people help. It's been 3 months in the planning, and Frank has been keeping it together with the particular stubbornness of a man who made a promise and intends to keep it. I don't need a tribute, she said. I know you don't, Reed said. That's not the point. She was quiet. Hank's been gone 4 years, he said, and you've been doing this alone. Not helplessly alone, and everyone knows that. But still, the people of this town want to say something. They want you to hear it. Outside, a truck went past on the main road. A door closed somewhere in the building. The clock on Reed's desk ticked. 30 years, she said finally. 30 years, he agreed. She sat with this for a long moment, her hands folded on the table, in the same manner she had folded them that morning at the diner. The stillness of someone who is not performing, but simply being. Then she said, "You'd better tell me what Frank needs." And Reed Armstrong, who had spent 11 years in that chair, dealing with the full range of human difficulty that a county sheriff encounters, and who had in that time learned to read the specific texture of different kinds of emotion in people's faces, thought he saw the very edge of something cross Nora Holden's face in that moment. Not softness exactly, more like the particular quality of a woman who has been carrying something alone for a long time, and has just for the first time in a while been permitted to set it down. He leaned forward and told her what Frank had planned. And outside the county sheriff's office, in the June afternoon of Mill Haven, Tennessee, the town continued its Thursday, not knowing yet what the evening would bring, but moving toward it steadily, and with a collective unconscious sense that something was about to happen that would matter the way small towns sometimes feel their own moments before the moments arrive. The afternoon moved through the county the way June afternoons move in Tennessee slowly, with heat in it, the kind of heat that softens edges and slows motion and makes the light look like something you could hold in your hands. Nora drove back through Mill Haven after leaving Reed's office. She did not go straight home. She stopped first at the bakery. Carolyn Weiss was behind the counter the way she was always behind the counter on Thursday afternoons. A small woman with flour on her apron and gray in her hair that she did not bother to hide, which was a decision Nora had always respected. The bakery smelled of bread and something sweet, a coffee cake Carolyn made on Thursdays that had been on the menu since she first opened the place. The smell was the kind of smell that makes a person feel for a moment as though they are somewhere safe. Nora had always thought that was worth something, that you could provide that to people, that particular brief sense of being sheltered just through the work of your hands in a hot oven and 22 years of showing up. "I heard about this morning," Carolyn said, because in Mill Haven, this was apparently the sentence of the day. "It's going around," Nora said. "Robert called me right after." Carolyn set a coffee cake slice on a plate and put it on the counter without asking. "He said you just sat there. There wasn't much else to do." Carolyn looked at her. "You sent that text." "I sent a text, yes." Carolyn smiled. It was a smile with history in it. "I've known you 20 years, she said. "You sent that text, and then you just sat there with your coffee." "The coffee was good." Carolyn laughed. It was a genuine laugh, the kind that belongs to people who have learned to keep hold of lightness, even when things have been heavy. "I was there this morning," she said. "You know that. I came in after Robert." She looked down at the counter for a moment. "I heard what you said to them at the end, about the town being your town." "It's everyone's town." "Yes." Carolyn was quiet for a moment. "But some people hold it more than others. Some people are part of why it holds together." She met Nora's eyes. "You've never wanted anyone to say that to you, I know. But it's true, and I'm saying it, and you can decide what to do with it." Nora ate the coffee cake. It was very good. It had always been very good. She thought about how 4 years ago the letter from the landlord had arrived at this bakery, raising the rent by 60%, and how Carolyn had called her in tears, not asking for anything, just needing someone to tell, and how Nora had said, "I'll take care of it," not knowing exactly how, only knowing that she would find a way. She thought about that drive 3 towns over, the afternoon light coming in sideways through the truck windows. She had not planned what she would say. She rarely did. She found that if you were clear in yourself about what you stood for, the words came when you arrived. She did not know what she had said in that office, only what the result had been. "I'll see you tonight," Nora said when she was done with the coffee cake. Carolyn looked at her with an expression that asked a question. "Reed told me," Nora said. "Don't yell at him. I needed to know." Carolyn put a hand over her mouth. Her eyes went bright. "Frank is going to be so angry," she said. "Frank will survive. He's been so careful. 3 months of careful." But she was smiling through the bright eyes. "I won't let on that I know," Nora said. "I'll be surprised. I'll be convincingly surprised." "You have never been convincingly surprised in your life," Carolyn said, which was true enough that Nora did not argue it. She drove home. She did some more garden work, the kind that requires attention, but not thought, the honest physical repetition of tending something. She showered. She put on clean jeans and a dark shirt. She stood at the closet for a moment looking at the jacket. She took it off its hook and held it for a moment. The leather was warm from the closet, which was always slightly warm from the afternoon sun through the window. The patches were all there. They had always been all there. She put it on. She had not planned to wear it tonight, but standing in the closet light with the jacket in her hands, she had understood that there was no other thing to wear to a thing like this. The jacket was 30 years of her life. If the town wanted to honor 30 years of her life, it should see all of them. She drove back to Carver's Diner at 6:45. She pulled into the lot and sat in her truck for a moment. The front windows of the diner were lit with ordinary light. She could not see the back room from here, and Frank had apparently done something to the windows to obscure whatever he had set up. She could see Brenda's silhouette moving behind the counter, which meant the diner was still presenting normally from the outside. She appreciated the discipline of that. She went inside. Frank Carver was at the counter. He looked at her when she came in with the expression of a man who has been keeping a secret for 3 months and is now extremely close to not keeping it but is holding on. "Nora," he said, "didn't expect you back tonight." "I thought I'd get some dinner," she said. "Unless you're closed." No, we're open," Frank said. "Kitchen's running. We've got the special tonight." She sat at the counter. She ordered the special, which was Frank's pork chops, which had been the Thursday special for as long as she could remember. She ate slowly and talked to Frank about nothing in particular, about the weather, and about the stretch of county road out on the east side that needed resurfacing, and about whether the high school baseball team was going to do anything this season, and Frank answered with the careful engagement of a man keeping a conversation going while managing a considerable amount of anticipation just below the surface. At a few minutes to 7, the front door opened. She recognized the footsteps without turning. Vance Briggs walked like a man who has spent a lot of time on motorcycles, which gives a particular gait rolling slightly at the shoulders, unhurried. He was in his 40s, broad through the chest, with the kind of face that outdoor work and genuine attention to people give you over time. He was wearing his vest. He came to the counter and sat down beside her, and Frank poured him a coffee. "Evening," he said. "Evening," she said. They sat for a moment in the comfortable silence of people who do not need to feel quiet. Vance drank his coffee. Nora finished her pork chops. Then Frank said from the far end of the counter, with the careful casualness of someone reading from an invisible script, "There's something in the back room I wanted to show you, Nora. Got a new piece of equipment. Wanted your opinion before I finalized the purchase." Nora looked at him. He looked back with the expression of a man who has just said the least convincing sentence of his entire life and knows it. "Sure," she said. Frank led her to the back room doors. Vance walked beside her, and Frank Carver, who had owned this diner for 19 years and who had spent 3 months organizing something he believed in, completely opened the door. The room erupted. Not the roar of a crowd at a large event, because this was a back room in a small-town diner and not a stadium, but the roar of something more personal than that. It was the sound of perhaps 60 people who knew one another and who knew the woman in the doorway and who had been waiting to make this sound for 3 months and who made it now with the particular intensity of people for whom the occasion is real rather than ceremonial. Nora stopped in the doorway, veterans with their caps and their straight spines, families with children on their hips, and teenagers at their sides. The former kids from the mentorship program that she and Hank had started 17 years ago, grown now, some of them with children of their own, people who would not be the people they were without the early intervention of someone who had decided they were worth investing in. Carolyn was there smiling and crying simultaneously with the efficiency of someone who has been waiting a long time to do both. Robert Monroe stood near the wall with his cane and his VFW cap and the particular stillness of a man who means what he has come to say. Knox Dixon was near the back, nodding once at Nora, with an expression that communicated everything he would not know how to say out loud. On the wall behind the tables, someone Frank most likely had mounted a large framed photograph. She recognized it immediately. It was taken in the early years, Hank and Nora on their bikes at a chapter rally, Hank grinning at the camera with the big, unguarded grin he reserved for moments he was genuinely happy. Nora beside him, with her hand on his arm, looking at something off to the right, with the particular expression she wore when something had caught her attention. She had not seen that photograph in years. She had not known Frank had a copy of it, and beside it on a wooden plaque that had clearly been made by someone who knew how to work with wood, her name was carved. Nora Holden. 30 years of service to the Millhaven community. Below her name, a smaller line, in the memory of Hank Holden. She stood in the doorway for a long time. The room let her stand there. Nobody spoke for those first moments, which was exactly right, because some moments need to be breathed before they can be spoken. Vance put his hand on her shoulder briefly, the way old friends do, when they understand that a person needs something steady nearby, and that the steady thing does not need to announce itself to be present. He would have loved this, he said. She did not say anything. She was looking at the photograph. At Hank's face, the grin, the particular quality of a man who was entirely at home in his own life. She thought about the Tuesday in October. She thought about the phone calls she had made from the hospital waiting room, one after another, and how she had kept her voice level through all of them, because there was nothing to be gained from not keeping her voice level. She thought about the 4 years of mourning since, which had been harder in the way of things that are hard without anyone witnessing them. The private arithmetic of continuing. She looked at the room full of people who were there because of something she and Hank had built together in a town they had both loved. She felt in a way she had not felt in a long time the particular complex weight of having been seen. Not the uncomfortable self-consciousness of being observed, the different and rarer thing of being seen accurately, of having the people around you understand what your life has been and hold it with care. She crossed the threshold. She went to Robert Monroe first. She put her hand in his and said something quietly, and he said something back, and they stood that way for a moment, two people who have known each other a long time and trust what they know. She moved through the room slowly. She talked to everyone who wanted to talk. She held a child whose parents she had helped when they were teenagers. She hugged Carolyn for longer than she usually allowed herself to hug people. She shook hands with a man she had helped 15 years ago, whose name had slipped slightly in her memory over the years, but whose face and the specific quality of gratitude in his eyes had not. She accepted a card that the youth center kids had made collectively, a construction paper thing with 30 names signed in different colors of marker, the handwriting ranging from the neat to the catastrophically enthusiastic. Frank brought her coffee. He was in the specific, emotional state of a man who has pulled off a large, logistical thing and is experiencing the complex satisfaction of that, which includes relief in equal measure to pride. "You knew," he said. "Reed told me," she said. He made an exasperated sound. "That man. Don't be angry with him. I needed to know. You know me. I know you." Frank looked at the room, at the 60 people packed into a space designed for considerably fewer, all of them talking and eating and being present with one another in the way that people are present when something real has gathered them. "Did I do it right?" She looked at him. He was a middle-aged man with a dish rag over his shoulder and flour still on his hands from the afternoon baking, and he had spent 3 months organizing something in secret because he believed that some things deserved to be honored, and he was the kind of man who acted on that belief. "You did it right," she said. She had been in the room for perhaps 40 minutes when a sound began. It started low, the way it always started, at a distance which is what made it recognizable before it arrived. The particular rolling engine note of motorcycles in formation. Not one or two, but many. The sound building as they came closer, coming down Main Street, with the deliberate pacing of people who understand that some moments deserve to be entered slowly. The room heard it. People went to the front windows. Someone opened the door, and the sound came in unmistakably, 42 motorcycles in a procession, 2 by 2 down the center of Main Street, led by Vance Briggs, on the bike Hank had ridden for 8 years before him, and that Vance rode now, not because he needed to, but because certain things are honored through use rather than display. They rode with the particular dignity of men who have agreed to do something together and are doing it exactly as agreed. 2 by 2, unhurried, the engine note steady and low. People came out of the businesses along the street. The hardware store owner stood in his doorway. The couple from the barber shop came out to the sidewalk. A family that had been walking to the drugstore stopped on the corner. People who had been at home came to their porches when they heard the sound, because a sound like that carries, and because people in small towns know the difference between ordinary passage and something that matters. The motorcycles filled 2 blocks along Main Street when they had all parked, the line stretching from the diner to the far intersection, the engines going quiet one by one in a way that created its own kind of sound. The gradual settling of that particular noise, like a wave receding. Vance came back inside. He stood beside Nora and looked at the room and at the people, and then he said to the room, in the straightforward way of a man who does not require ceremony but understands its purpose. Iron Valley has been in this county for 35 years. We have had 2 presidents in that time. Hank Holden, who built something worth building, and who is gone, and whose absence we have all learned to live inside. And beside him for all of those years was this woman. He did not use formal language. He did not use prepared remarks. He said what he meant in the order that he meant it. And what he said was about Hank and about Nora and about what it means to commit to a place and its people over the long term, past the point where it is comfortable, past the point where it costs nothing, into the deeper territory where commitment means doing things that are hard and inconvenient and sometimes lonely. He talked about what he had learned from both of them. He talked about what Iron Valley was because of what they had built, not just the chapter, but the community around it, the web of connections and mutual obligation that had made Millhaven a place where 60 people could fill a back room at 7 in the evening to honor a woman who had never once asked to be honored. When he finished, there was a long moment, and then the room did the sound again, the particular, intimate sound of people being genuinely glad. And Nora stood in the middle of it and did something that she had not done in front of other people in 4 years. She let herself cry. Not performance, not collapse. The specific, clean release of a person who has been holding something carefully for a long time and has finally found the right place to set it down. Meanwhile, in the front of the diner, a different kind of evening was unfolding. Paul and Sandra Dalton had not left when Nora walked out that morning. They had sat in their booth for a long time after she left, after Reed Armstrong left, after the other people had settled back into their ordinary morning activity and were careful to not look at them directly, which has a particular quality in a small town, the deliberate practice of not looking, that is itself a form of communication. They had eventually ordered food they did not much eat. They had spoken to each other in low voices. Paul had made a phone call outside in the parking lot that lasted a long time, and when he came back in, he looked like a man who had heard something he was in the process of deciding how to respond to. Their attorney, a man named Gerald Foote, who practiced in the county seat and who had been on retainer for Paul Dalton for 2 years, arrived at the diner at 2 in the afternoon. He was a compact, careful man who spoke in the measured register of someone who always thinks about what he says before he says it, which is a good quality in an attorney and a sometimes difficult quality in a person. He sat with the Daltons for 90 minutes. When he came out, he went directly to his car and did not speak to anyone. What Paul Dalton had learned from Gerald Foote, and what Gerald Foote had learned that afternoon from 2 phone calls of his own, was that the situation was considerably worse than a diner incident and a confrontational woman with a manila envelope. The state attorney general's office had been building a case for 7 months, working from the same thread that Nora had been working from the other end, beginning with a complaint filed in Callaway County 18 months ago by a woman named Edith Donahue, who had sold her land under circumstances that she later came to understand had not been accurately represented to her. The thread had grown. The Millhaven documentation that Nora had been providing to Reed Armstrong over the past 3 weeks had filled gaps in the state's file that had slowed their timeline. The 2 tracks had now effectively merged, and what existed as a result was a case that had the weight of a sustained official investigation backed by a significant body of private documentation collected by a woman who had spent 5 months being patient and thorough. Gerald Foote's advice to Paul Dalton was not what Paul Dalton wanted to hear, and the conversation in the diner booth had been by all visible evidence uncomfortable. But Gerald Foote had been giving Paul Dalton accurate legal advice for 2 years, which was his job. And the accurate legal advice was that the question was no longer whether there would be consequences, but what those consequences would look like and how the management of them would be handled. Paul sat in the front booth of Carver's Diner for the rest of the afternoon, which was not his choice, but was the result of the specific quality of paralysis that comes over some people when the situation they are in has outgrown all the strategies they have ever used to manage situations. Sandra sat beside him. They had stopped talking to each other in any meaningful way around mid-afternoon, but neither of them had left. There was nowhere to go that was clearly better. Home meant sitting with what the afternoon had delivered without the distraction of a room around them. So they stayed. When the people began arriving in the early evening, the ones filing into the back room with the particular energy of people going to something that matters to them, the Daltons watched from the front booth. Paul watched with the expression of a man performing indifference over something else. Sandra watched more openly with the expression of someone beginning to understand the actual shape of a thing they have been part of. She saw Frank's face when the room opened up. She saw the photograph on the wall from where she sat through the open door before someone shifted and blocked her view. She saw Vance Briggs move through the diner with the natural authority of someone who belongs entirely to the space he is moving through, a quality Paul had always performed and never possessed. And Sandra had always known the difference privately and had long ago set that knowledge aside. She saw the people, all of them, the veterans and the families and the young parents with children, and the people whose faces she did not know, but who carried on their faces the specific expression of people gathered around something real. She watched them through the open backroom door, and something in her did a thing she had not anticipated. She thought about the pharmacist's counter, the girl with the stutter. She could not remember the girl's face exactly, but she remembered her own voice and the way it had sounded, the register of it, and she understood sitting in the booth of this diner at 7 in the evening of a Thursday in June that she had done that. Not in the abstract, in the real. There had been a person with a stutter, and Sandra had imitated her publicly because she had thought it would be amusing, and because she had been entirely certain in that moment, as she had been entirely certain in most moments of her life, that she was the kind of person who was free to do such things. She was reckoning now, for the first time in a long time, with the possibility that she had been wrong about what kind of person she was. This was not the same as being a different person. It was not redemption in any satisfying sense. It was simply the first step, which is the one that hurts the most because the others are built on it, of looking at a thing you have done and naming it accurately. Nora came back through the front of the diner at some point in the evening, moving from the back room to the counter, and Sandra watched her cross the room. She moved with the ease of someone completely at home in a place she has come to over many years, greeting Frank, nodding to Brenda, stopping to say something to Robert Monroe that made the old man's face change in the way faces change when something touches them where they actually live. Sandra said quietly to Paul, "I want to write letters." Paul looked at her. "To the people in this room," she said, "and to the others, the families. I want to write to each of them." Paul was quiet for a long time. He was a man who had spent his adult life managing situations rather than experiencing them, and this was not a situation that could be managed in the way he had managed things before. Something in him was working through that. It was not quick. He was not finished with it by the end of that evening, and would not be for a long time. But he said eventually, "Yeah." She nodded. She looked back at the room. She watched Nora standing at the counter with her coffee and her jacket and her 30 years, and she tried to understand what she was looking at. She did not fully succeed. Some things take longer than one evening, but she was trying, and that was different from not trying, and it was the difference that mattered. Outside on Main Street, the 42 motorcycles stood in their line along the curb, chrome catching the evening light, engines cooling the particular waiting quality of machines at rest that belong to people who know how to be patient. A few riders stood along the sidewalk in the warm evening, talking quietly. A family that had come out to see the procession was still on the sidewalk across the street, the children looking at the bikes with the expression children have in the presence of something that has managed to be both powerful and beautiful at the same time. The town had come to its sidewalks. This was the kind of night that people in small places remember for years, not because it was dramatic, though it had been that, but because it contained the things that make a place more than geography. People standing up for each other, accountability arrived at through patience rather than violence. An old woman in a leather jacket who had spent 30 years holding something together, and a room full of people who knew it and had come to say so. Reed Armstrong drove by slowly in his cruiser at 8:30, not stopping, just passing, the way a sheriff who knows his county passes through it at the end of a long day. He looked at the line of motorcycles. He looked at the lit windows of the diner. He drove on. Inside, the room was still full and still warm and still doing the thing that rooms do when real community is in them, which is to sustain a particular quality of human presence that is not always available and that people recognize when they find it, even if they cannot always name what it is. It is the sense of being in the company of people who are genuinely present with each other, who have not come to perform something, but to be something, which is a different thing entirely. Nora sat at the counter for a while. She talked to people. She let Frank give her a second slice of pork chops, which she ate without ceremony. She accepted a beer that one of the Chapter brothers produced from somewhere, and which she drank slowly while talking to a young man named Tyler, who had been through the mentorship program 12 years ago, and who was now a high school teacher in the next county, and who had driven 2 hours tonight to be here, and who said in the direct, unornamented way of someone who has decided to say a thing and is going to say it, "You changed my life. I want you to know I know that." She looked at him for a moment. He was in his late 20s, steady-eyed, a man who had clearly become someone worth being, and there was in his face the particular quality of a person who is not asking for anything from the person they are thanking, which is the only kind of gratitude that lands cleanly. "You changed your own life," she said. "You just needed someone to stay out of the way." He shook his head. "No, you need to let me say this." She let him say it. He said it, and she sat with it. The evening went on. More food appeared. The Chapter brothers, whose presence filled the front of the diner and spilled onto the sidewalk, were models of consideration, orderly in the particular way of men who are used to operating as a group and who understand that they are in someone else's space. They brought coffee from thermoses. They ate sandwiches from a bag. They talked among themselves with a low, efficient communication of people who know each other well, and do not require volume. At 9:10, a minor commotion at the front of the diner. Not a confrontation, a development. Two state police vehicles pulled up outside. Two officers came in not in the manner of officers responding to something, but in the manner of officers delivering something. They came to the counter and asked for Nora Holden, and Frank pointed her out, and they went to her with the particular careful respect of officials in the presence of someone they have been briefed to treat with careful respect. They had papers from the state attorney general, papers relating to an emergency injunction on the Dalton Development Project pending formal fraud proceedings. They also had attached a notice of detention for Paul Dalton for questioning in connection with the Callaway County fraud complaint. Paul Dalton in the front booth saw the state police come in and stood before they reached him in the manner of a man who has been waiting for the thing to arrive and has decided to stand for it rather than sit. He said to Sandra something quiet. She nodded. He went with the officers without incident. Sandra sat alone in the front booth for a moment. Then she got up, took her coat from the seat beside her, and walked back through the diner. People moved for her without drama, creating a clear path. She stopped at the counter a few feet from Nora. She said, "I'm going to write those letters." She said it to Nora, specifically looking at her directly, which was perhaps harder than it sounds. "Not because it'll change anything. I know it won't. But because I want to." She paused. "For whatever that's worth." Nora looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, "The woman at the pharmacy, Debbie, she's at the community college now." Sandra held her gaze. "I know what I did." "I know you do," Nora said. Sandra nodded. She walked out of the diner. Through the window, Nora watched her get into the car she had come in that morning and drive out of the lot and down the street and around the corner and out of sight. Brenda came up beside her. "What happens now?" Brenda asked. Nora thought about it. "She writes letters," she said. "Some of them help, some of them don't. Either way, the people get to choose what to do with them." She picked up her coffee. "That's how it should be." She turned back to the room. Frank was at the pass-through watching everything with the expression of a man who has organized a party and is still 3 hours in, not entirely sure it is real. Robert Monroe had claimed a chair near the wall and was holding court for a small group that included Knox Dixon and 2 of the chapter brothers, and a woman whose name Nora did not know, but who was laughing at something Robert had said with the genuine abandon of someone surprised into laughter, which is the best kind. The photograph of her and Hank on the wall had its own small cluster of people, folks who had known Hank standing in front of it and saying things to each other in low voices that Nora could not hear from where she stood, but whose quality she could read from the faces, which were the faces of people telling good stories about someone they had loved. Vance was near the door talking to 2 of the chapter brothers, but he caught her eye across the room and gave her the nod that meant he was staying as long as she needed, which was what it had always meant and which she was grateful for. She looked at all of it, the room full of people who were there because of something she and Hank had chosen to do with their lives, in a place they had decided to love. The evening that was both more and less than it had been planned to be. The day that had started with ice water and 7 words and had arrived through the long turning mechanisms of consequence and community and the patient work of building something over decades here. She was 69 years old. She was tired in the good way, the way that follows a day that has been fully inhabited. Her jacket was dry, the patches were all there. She picked up her coffee, and she stayed. At 9:45, Vance tapped his coffee mug on the counter twice, the signal he had used for 17 years to get a room's attention without raising his voice. The room quieted. "We're going to do something before the night ends," he said, "and I want Nora up here for it." She came to stand beside him. She did not know what was coming. Reed had told her about the tribute, about the room and the photograph and the plaque, but he had not told her everything, because Reed was the kind of man who understood that some things need to remain a surprise, even when the larger shape of them is known. Vance reached into the inside pocket of his vest and took out something small, a patch. Iron Valley MC, the same as the ones on her jacket, but this one was different. It was the patch given to someone who had been voted a full honorary member of the chapter, which had happened exactly twice in Iron Valley's 35-year history, both times posthumously, and which had never in the history of the chapter been given to a woman. He held it out to her. The room was completely silent. She looked at it for a long time. She looked at Vance, who was holding it with the steadiness of someone who has thought a great deal about this moment and is now simply in it. She looked at the chapter brothers, 42 of them, in the front of the diner and out on the sidewalk, who had voted on this 3 weeks ago unanimously, which was a thing that had never happened in 35 years. "This was Hank's idea," Vance said. "Before he died, he asked me." He paused. "He said you'd try to say you didn't need it. He said to give it to you anyway. He said you'd know what it means." She knew what it meant. It meant that the thing they had built was not Hank's thing that she had stood beside. It was theirs. It had always been theirs. This was the chapter saying it officially in the language of patch and vote, and the long institutional memory of a brotherhood that had been keeping those records for 35 years. She took it from Vance's hand. She held it for a moment. She thought about Hank. She thought about the nights they had ridden together, the long roads through Tennessee and Kentucky and West Virginia, the particular quality of being beside someone who was entirely himself and who gave you room to be entirely yourself, and who found those two things together to be sufficient, and in fact, more than sufficient. She thought about all of it. Then she said to the room, which was the room she had helped build over 30 years, "Thank you, not more than that." The room let it be enough. She put the patch in her jacket pocket. She would sew it on later at home, at the kitchen table, where she had sewn patches for 30 years. She would take her time with it. Frank appeared from behind the counter with a tray of something dessert, apparently the kind of detail he had managed to organize without anyone noticing. There was general movement and general sound, the room relaxing back into the warm noise of an occasion that has said what it needed to say, and is now settling into the comfortable second half of the evening, where food reappears and conversations get easier, and the specific texture of a good gathering accumulates. Knox Dixon found her near the back of the room later, and they talked for a while about his shop, about a new hire he was considering, about whether a second location was premature or well-timed. The kind of conversation they had been having for years, practical and direct, and between equals, in the way that matters when one person is the other's original mentor. The recognition that the student has become something the mentor is not responsible for. He was his own person. She was proud of him in the way you are proud of something that has become independent of you, which is a different and better kind of proud than the other kind. At some point during the evening, Carolyn found her sitting at a small table with Robert Monroe and a chapter brother named Wade, whose real name nobody used, because Wade had been his road name for 20 years. They were talking about nothing much, the way people talk at the end of a long evening, when the important things have been said, and what remains is the good, ordinary company of being among people you trust. Carolyn sat down with them, and the four of them talked for another half hour about things that did not matter much, and mattered a great deal for being said among people who belonged to each other. Outside Main Street was quiet now. The town had gone to bed. The sidewalks were empty, except for the line of motorcycles still along the curb, still in their formation, waiting for the night to be done. A few riders were still out there on chairs someone had brought from the diner, drinking coffee from thermoses. The evening had gone fully dark, and the streetlights made the chrome of the bikes glow with a particular warmth of metal in yellow light, and the whole sight of it, the long, quiet line of machines, parked in the Tennessee night in front of a lit diner full of people, was the kind of sight that does not translate well into description, because it is too much itself to be reduced to words. But it was the kind of sight that stays with the people who see it, that comes back to them in the years after, when they are trying to explain something to a grandchild or a stranger about what a place was, what a community looked like when it was working the way it was supposed to work. Reed drove by again at 10:30. This time, he stopped. He came inside and got a coffee and stood at the counter and talked to Frank for a while. And then he came and sat with Nora for a few minutes, and they talked in the way they had talked over 11 years, and some hard conversations, and an accumulated understanding of each other that was neither simple nor uncomplicated, but was honest and therefore worth more than simpler things. "The Fosters called me this afternoon," he said. "How are they?" "Better." He drank his coffee. "The injunction on the project helps. Knowing the land isn't going anywhere for the foreseeable future helps." He paused. "Edith Donahue in Callaway. She called too. She said she heard about what happened this morning. Word travels. All the way to Callaway, apparently." He looked at his coffee. "She said to tell you thank you. She said she'd been holding her breath for 18 months. Nora was quiet for a moment. She thought about Edith Donahue, whom she had never met, who had filed a complaint a year and a half ago, out of the simple knowledge that what had been done to her was wrong and that someone should know about it, and who had been waiting since then for something to happen. "Tell her she was the one who started it," Nora said. "She did the hard part first." Reed nodded. He finished his coffee and stood. He looked at the room, the same long look he had given it when he came in, the practiced assessment of a man who reads rooms by training, and by now by something deeper than training. "Good night," he said. "Good night," she said. He went out. Through the window, she watched him get in his cruiser and drive away out of sight, around the corner back to wherever the rest of his evening was taking him. She watched the red taillights go and thought about the years she had known him, the friction and the respect, the difficult moments and the honest ones. And she thought that you could build a life around people like that, people with whom you did not always agree, but with whom you were always honest, and that this was worth considerably more than easier relationships built on less friction and less truth. The evening wound down slowly, the way good evenings do. People gathered their things without urgency. There were long goodbyes, of the kind that happen between people who do not see each other often enough. Children were collected from corners where they had fallen asleep. The particular organized chaos of 60 people trying to leave a room at approximately the same time resolved itself gradually into a stream, and then a trickle, and then the last few people at the door lingering, not quite ready to have it be over. Frank was already cleaning up with the methodical focus of a man who has been in the food business long enough to find comfort in the familiar routines of the end of a service. Brenda was at the counter with a cloth and the same steady efficiency she brought to everything she did. The back room was being restored toward its ordinary configuration, tables moved back, chairs straightened, though the photograph and the plaque remained on the wall, and Frank had told no one he planned to take them down, which suggested he did not. Nora sat at the counter with the last of her coffee and watched the room settle back into itself. The Chapter brothers had gone one by one and then in small groups back out to the bikes on Main Street. She had said goodbye to each of them, had thanked each one by name, which she was able to do because she had known most of them for years, and the rest she had made the effort to learn tonight. Vance had been last standing in the diner door with the June night behind him and the line of bikes visible over his shoulder. "Get home safe," she said. "Always," he said. He looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone who has done a thing they set out to do and is at peace with how it went. "He would have been so proud of you," he said. She held his gaze. "I know," she said. He nodded. He went out. She finished her coffee. She picked up her jacket from the counter stool where she had set it down sometime during the evening, and she put it back on, settling it over her shoulders, feeling the weight of it, the familiar heaviness of the leather and the patches. She put her hand in the jacket pocket and felt the new patch there, the honorary member patch that Hank had arranged before he died, that Vance had carried for 4 years, waiting for the right moment. She took it out and looked at it one more time in the light of the diner. Small, solid, the edges clean, the same colors as the rest. It belonged with the others. It would be there tomorrow, sewn on properly, part of the jacket's permanent record. She put it back in her pocket. "Good night, Frank," she said. "Good night, Nora." He looked up from his cleaning. He looked at her in the direct, unguarded way of a man at the end of a long and good day. "Thank you for being here," he said, which was a funny way to put it given that it was a party in her honor, but she understood what he meant, and it was exactly right. She went out into the June night. Main Street was empty now, except for a few lingering riders, finishing their conversations, the low rumble of conversation, and the sound of boots on pavement. The air was warm and carried the end-of-the-day smells of a small town in summer. Cut grass, and the bakery's cooling ovens, and the particular dry, clean smell of the pavement after a day of heat. The line of motorcycles was still along the curb, most of them just waiting for the last riders to finish their conversations and mount up. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment. She looked down Main Street at the lit windows of Carver's Diner, at the dark windows of the hardware store, and the barber shop, and the post office, at the street she had known for 30 years, at the place she had chosen, and that had, over those 30 years, chosen her back. She thought about Hank. She always did. She thought about the Tuesday in October, and the years before it, and the years since it. She thought about the kitchen table, and the garden, and the long work of building something worth building in a place you have decided to love. She thought about the notebook and the 5 months and the 11 families, and she thought about the new notebook she had started 2 days ago, which still had mostly blank pages, but which would, as blank pages do when you bring them to work, eventually not be blank. She thought about tomorrow morning, which would be a Friday, and which would bring whatever it brought, in which she would meet the same way she had met all the other mornings since Hank died, which was by getting up and making coffee, and standing at the kitchen window, and looking at the garden, and deciding, not dramatically, but in the simple, habitual way of someone for whom continuing is not a crisis, but a practice to continue. One by one, the engines on Main Street started, low and steady and unmistakable, that particular sound filling the street and rising above the rooftops, and going out into the Tennessee night in every direction. The riders mounted, the formation assembled, and Nora Holden, 69 years old, a widow and a biker and a neighbor, and a woman who had spent 30 years quietly holding things together and would spend the next 30 doing the same, stood on the sidewalk in front of Carver's Diner and watched her people go. She drove home through roads she knew. The headlights of her truck cut through the dark in that familiar way, illuminating the specific stands of trees and the particular curves of county roads that you learn so thoroughly over decades that you stop seeing them with attention and start navigating them with something closer to memory, your hands knowing where to turn before your mind has finished forming the instruction. She had driven these roads at every hour and in every condition, in rain and ice, and the blue-black winter dark, and the bright impossibility of June, and the roads had always brought her home. The house was dark when she pulled into the driveway. It was always dark now when she came home at night, which was something she had not entirely adjusted to 4 years in the particular quality of a lit window that you stop having when the person who used to leave lights on for you is gone. She had thought about it sometimes in the early months about leaving a light on for herself, but it had seemed like a gesture performed for an audience that was no longer there, and she had never been a woman for unnecessary gestures. She unlocked the door and went in. She turned on the kitchen light and stood in the warmth of it for a moment. The house had the settled quiet of a place that is lived in, and known the smell of the garden coming in through the window she had left cracked, the smell of coffee from the pot she had made that morning. She moved through the familiar geography of her kitchen with the ease of someone who knows where everything is in the dark. She filled the kettle, she put it on, she took off her jacket and draped it over the back of a chair, but before she set it down, she reached into the pocket and took out the patch. She set it on the table in front of her. She looked at it in the kitchen light. Honorary member, Iron Valley MC. The design was the same as the others, the same colors she had been living with for 30 years. Hank had arranged it. Vance had told her before he died, had asked Vance to hold it until the right moment. She tried to construct the conversation in her mind. Hank and Vance, probably in the workshop, probably over coffee. Hank in his matter-of-fact way saying the thing he needed to say, and then moving on to something else. Because Hank had never been a man who needed to linger in the important moments to prove they were important. He had trusted the moments to carry themselves. She had done the same. All her life, she had trusted the moments to carry themselves. She had not announced things. She had not explained herself. She had done the work and trusted that the work would be its own argument, and mostly it had been, and tonight had been a room full of evidence of that, the accumulated proof in 60 human faces of a life spent on the right side of the ledger. She picked up the patch. She went to the sewing box on the counter, the one she had used for 30 years, and she took out a needle and thread. Heavy thread, the right color. She had done this more times than she could count, mending patches back onto leather, reinforcing edges, adding new ones. Her hands knew this work the way they knew garden work and kitchen work and the work of tending machines. The satisfying physical certainty of a thing that has a right way to be done. She sat at the kitchen table and she sewed. The kettle boiled. She got up and made her tea and sat back down and kept sewing. The house was quiet around her. The June night was warm. Through the open window came the sound of crickets and the distant occasional sound of a truck on the county road. The ordinary nighttime sound of the rural place she lived in, which was not the absence of sound, but the presence of the sounds that belonged to the hour. She thought about tomorrow, about what Reed had told her regarding the state investigation and what the Attorney General's timeline looked like, about the 11 families, about the Fosters on Ridgeline Road, and the old man who had driven himself to the sheriff's office because he had not known what else to do. About Edith Donahue in Callaway, who had started something 18 months ago by filing a complaint and holding her breath. The world did not change because one woman sat in a diner and absorbed ice water and said 7 words and then waited. It changed because of 5 months of patient work and because of a sheriff who built a 7-month file and because of a state attorney general's office that had been working its own thread, and because of 11 families who had been scared and had found the courage to tell their stories anyway, and because of Robert Monroe, who stood up on a counter stool and said what he knew, and Carolyn, who said what she knew, and Knox, who said what he knew. The world changed when it changed through the accumulation of small, true things. Through patient people doing the work without needing to see the full shape of it while they were doing it. She had learned this a long time ago, and she had never unlearned it. She finished sewing the patch. She tied off the thread. She held the jacket up and looked at it in the kitchen light. The new patch was in the right place, lower left, below the Iron Valley main patch, where honorary member designation belonged, per the chapter's tradition. It looked right. It looked like it had always been there. She put the jacket on the back of the chair and drank her tea. She was tired. It was the good kind of tired, the kind that comes from a day that has required something of you, and that you have met fully, and that you can now release because the day is done. She thought about bed, and she thought about the garden in the morning, and she thought briefly about Hank, the way she thought about him every night before she slept, which was not with grief now mostly, but with the particular kind of company that the dead keep when you have loved them well and been loved well back. She got up. She turned off the kitchen light. She went upstairs. The weeks after that Thursday moved differently than weeks usually move. Movement of that kind, the movement of consequence through a legal system, is not fast. It is not cinematic. It does not resolve in a single dramatic scene. It proceeds through the submission of documents and the scheduling of hearings and the measured conversations between attorneys and offices that do not look like anything in particular. It has the pace of official things, which is slow and thorough, and which to people who have been waiting for something to happen can feel almost unbearably gradual. But it moved. The State Attorney General's office filed formal charges against Paul Dalton 6 weeks after that Thursday. The charges related to fraudulent misrepresentation in property transactions across 3 counties a pattern of conduct that had been assembled over 18 months from multiple sources, and that now, with the documentation from Nora's 5-month collection, had the kind of evidential weight that makes proceedings feel less like a question and more like a determination. Gerald Foote, Paul's attorney, had advised him to cooperate, and Paul had cooperated in the partial, calculating way of a man who has been told that cooperation is in his interest, and who has not yet finished the internal negotiation between self-preservation and pride. The development project was enjoined. The land assemblage that had been proceeding quietly for 3 years through the purchase of individual parcels stopped, held in place by the injunction that the state police had delivered that evening, waiting for the resolution of the fraud proceedings before any of it could move forward. Whether it would ever move forward was, as of the following fall, unclear. 3 of the 11 families who had signed documents that did not accurately represent their rights received formal rescission offers, the legal mechanism by which a transaction can be unwound when fraud is established. 2 of them accepted. The third was still considering, having received advice that the value of what they had sold was likely higher than what had been established in the original transaction, and that patience might be warranted. Of the other 8 families, 3 had signed preliminary agreements that had not yet been finalized, and those agreements were effectively nullified by the fraud finding. 5 had been in the process of negotiation, and those negotiations stopped. The Fosters on Ridgeline Road received a letter from the state AG's office informing them that the original offer made to them had involved materially misrepresented information, and that they were under no legal obligation to honor any preliminary understanding they had entered into. The old man called Reed Armstrong after he received the letter and said, in the direct, unornamented way of an 81-year-old farmer who has had enough of being handled carefully, "Is this over?" Reed said, "For you, yes." The old man was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Tell Nora," and hung up. Reed told Nora. She was in her garden when he called, kneeling by the bean rows, her phone in her jacket pocket. She listened. She said, "Good." Then she went back to the beans. The letters Sandra Dalton had announced her intention to write were written. She wrote 14 of them, 1 to each person in the diner that morning, including Frank Carver and Brenda, and 1 each to Robert Monroe, Carolyn Weiss, Knox, Dixon, Gerald Weaver, Dorothy Haverford, the girl from the pharmacy counter whose name Sandra had not known and had to find through Frank Carver, and Edith Donahue in Callaway, whom she had never met. The letters were long. They were specific about particular incidents. They did not make excuses. They did not ask for anything. They described what Sandra understood herself to have done and what she understood about the impact of it, and they said what they said without requiring anything from the recipient. Carolyn received hers on a Tuesday morning and read it in the back of the bakery before the day's opening. She sat with it for a long time. She cried as she had said she expected to, though she still could not fully explain why. The letter acknowledged the bakery incident in detail, including the fact that Sandra had known exactly what she was doing and had made a choice to do it. The acknowledgement of the choice was what undid Carolyn. Not the apology itself, but the admission that it had been chosen. That the thing done to her had not been careless or thoughtless. That Sandra Dalton had looked at the situation and selected an action. That acknowledgement in Carolyn's experience of the world was rarer than apology and worth considerably more. Robert Monroe received his letter and read it at his kitchen table and said nothing to anyone about it except to Nora, whom he told over coffee a week later that it had said what it needed to say. He did not elaborate, and she did not ask him to. She understood that the letter had been received and processed, and that Robert Monroe, who had been at war and who had lived long enough to have very clear ideas about what words were for, had made his own assessment, and that his assessment was his own. The girl from the pharmacy counter, whose name was Debbie Sloan, was in her 2nd semester at community college. She received the letter at her mother's house, where she was still living while she went to school, and she read it 3 times. She showed it to her mother. Her mother asked her what she wanted to do with it. Debbie thought about it for 2 days, and then she wrote back. Not a long letter, 5 sentences. She thanked Sandra for writing. She said she remembered the incident. She said she had thought about it more than she wished she had. She said the apology did not erase what happened, but that it helped, and that she was grateful for something that helped. She said she hoped Sandra was doing the work she said she intended to do. She never received a response. She had not expected one. She had said what she needed to say, the same as anyone else. Dorothy Haverford, the first person the Daltons had approached in Millhaven 3 years ago. The elderly widow who had somehow found the courage to say no when the men in expensive casual clothes had come to her door the 3rd time. Received her letter at home, in the house she had lived in for 40 years, and where her husband had died, and where her grandchildren came in the summer. She read it carefully. She folded it. She put it in the drawer of the kitchen table where she kept things she needed to keep. She told Nora at the diner on a Thursday morning that the letter had made her cry, but that she could not explain why. When Carolyn said the same thing at a different moment, Nora thought about that for a while. She thought perhaps it was because the acknowledgement of a thing, the simple, clear admission that a thing happened, and that the person who did it knows it happened and knows it was wrong, is something the body responds to in a way that bypasses the mind's management of the situation. The body knows what it has been waiting for. The body knows when it has finally received it. She said this to Carolyn approximately once in those terms. Carolyn looked at her for a moment and then said, "When did you get to be so wise?" "I just got old," Nora said. "That's not the same thing." "Sometimes it is." The summer continued through its July and its August. The heat arrived and persisted. The garden required daily attention. Nora maintained her Thursday mornings at Carver's, which were the same as they had always been, and also different now because Frank had left the photograph and the plaque on the back room wall, and sometimes groups would rent the back room for parties or meetings, and they would see the photograph and ask Frank about it, and Frank would tell them briefly, in the concise way of someone who has told a story many times and knows where to cut. The story got around. It always got around. Knox Dixon hired the new mechanic he had been considering, and it turned out to be a good hire. A young woman from the next county who had learned engines from her father, and who reminded Knox a little of the version of himself that Nora had taken a chance on. He called Nora on a Sunday afternoon to tell her about it, and she listened and asked the right questions, and he could hear in her voice that she was pleased, not because she needed credit for the chain of events that had led to this moment, but because this was the kind of outcome she had been trying to create. A world where one person paying forward an act of faith resulted eventually in another act of faith being possible. She told him what she had told him at the beginning when he was 21 and freshly out and uncertain in the way that people are when they have just learned that the world is harder than it should be. The only thing the past should do is teach you, not define you. She had said it once 15 years ago. She said it now because it had been true then and was still true, and because Knox, in paying it forward, had proved it. Robert Monroe's knees continued to hold. He walked with his cane, but the walking was easier than it had been for years, and he walked as much as he could, which was considerable, because a man who has been unable to move freely and then becomes able to move freely does not take that freedom casually. He came to Carver's on most Thursday mornings. He and Nora had coffee and argued about things in the comfortable way of people who enjoy each other's company enough to not require agreement. He was still at war with the VA about certain things. He always would be. But the knees were good, and the VFW cap was always there, and he was 81 years old and going strong, which in his estimate was not something to complain about. The Fosters on Ridgeline Road planted their winter wheat in October, which they had done every October for 40 years, which was what farming is, the annual commitment renewed through the physical act of putting things in the ground, the long faith that what you plant will be there in spring. The old man drove the tractor himself, though his wife had her reservations about this, and the wheat went in straight and even along the eastern ridge of their property, which was their property, which was not going anywhere. Edith Donahue in Callaway received a letter from the state AG's office in September notifying her of the terms of the resolution regarding her property transaction, which included a recovery of the difference between what she had received and what a proper valuation would have established. It was not the full amount she had lost. The law rarely provides that, but it was something, and it acknowledged what had happened. And Edith Donahue, who had filed a complaint 18 months ago out of nothing but the simple stubborn knowledge that a wrong thing had been done to her and that someone should be told about it, sat in her kitchen and read the letter and then went and told her neighbor because the neighbor had been her witness throughout and deserved to know it was over. She thought about the woman from Millhaven she had never met, the woman Edith had heard about from the AG's office, who had spent 5 months collecting documentation and delivering it in a manila envelope on a Thursday morning. She thought about writing her a letter. She started it twice. She could not quite find the right words because what she wanted to say was not simple. She wanted to say thank you, but that was not quite it. She wanted to say you saw me, but that was also not quite it. She wanted to say something about the particular experience of being in a situation where you have done the right thing and nothing has happened, and you do not know if anything will happen. And then one day something does, and the something that happens connects back to your original act, and you understand that your act mattered, even though you could not see it mattering while you were in the middle of it. She kept not quite finding the words. Eventually, she decided that the letter she was trying to write required the kind of words she did not have, which was all right because some things do not fit in letters and are better carried and recognized when you meet the person, which she hoped someday she would. She put the draft away in the kitchen drawer and went about her life. In Millhaven, the fall came, the particular Tennessee fall that has the quality of a deep breath after summer, the air clearing, the light going gold, the hills turning through their colors. Nora's garden was winding down the last of the tomatoes, in the herbs, cut and dried and hanging in the kitchen, the ground prepared for its winter quiet. The peony was finished until next June. She had mulched it in the way she did every year, the annual transaction of protection and patience. On a Saturday morning in October, the anniversary weekend, she drove out to the cemetery. She went alone the way she always went. She brought nothing because Hank had always said flowers were for people who needed something to do with their hands, and she had no problem with her hands. And she understood that what she was doing was not about objects. She stood at the stone for a while. It was a good stone, solid granite, his name and dates, and below them, the Iron Valley patch insignia that Vance had arranged, which Hank would have liked because he was practical about that kind of thing, and would have appreciated the consistency of having the same symbol in the same place where it had always been. She told him about the Thursday. She told him in the abbreviated way she would have told him if he had been there, which was the way she always talked to him when she came, the edited version that trusts the listener to fill in what is left out. She told him about the 11 families and the documentation and the 7 words and the ice water. She told him about the back room and the photograph and the plaque. She told him about the patch. She put her hand on the stone for a moment. "You were right about the patch," she said. "You usually were." She stood there a while longer in the October morning, in the particular quiet of a cemetery in fall, which is one of the quieter things there is. Then she said what she always said at the end. It was a short thing, 4 words, the same 4 words every time, because some things do not require elaboration or variation. Some things are what they are. She drove home. She made coffee. She sat at the kitchen table with the jacket over the back of the chair where it always hung in the morning. The new patch was there, with the others settled in, no longer new, but already part of the whole, because that is what things become when they have been sewn in properly. She opened the notebook she had started in June, still not full pages, still turning, and she made some notes about a conversation she needed to have next week. A young woman out on Pine Creek Road who had finally returned her call, who had been visited 3 times by a man carrying paperwork, and who was uncertain about her rights and who needed someone patient and unhurried to sit with her and help her understand what she was looking at. The work continued. It always did. Not because it was dramatic, not because anyone would know about it, not because it led to anything as large as what had happened on a Thursday in June. Most of it never would. Most of it was small and daily and unglamorous. The unheroic labor of caring for a place and its people over the long, ordinary term. She would make the drive to Pine Creek Road next Tuesday. She would knock on the door. She would sit in whoever's kitchen she was invited into, and she would drink whatever was offered. And she would listen until the person was ready to talk, and then she would help them understand what they were looking at. It would take as long as it took. She had time. That was the thing about this kind of work. It required time and patience, and the willingness to not be finished, and to go back and to begin again, and to not require the outcome to be shaped the way you had imagined it while you were working toward it. It required trusting that the accumulation of small true things eventually becomes something that weighs enough to matter. She had learned this from Hank partly, and from 30 years in a community, and from the specific education of being the kind of person who pays attention to what is real rather than what is convenient to believe. She had learned it from the garden, which is perhaps the oldest school for this particular subject, because the garden does not care about your timeline and does not reward impatience, and teaches season after season the lesson that things grow at their own pace, and that your job is to prepare the conditions and show up. She closed the notebook. She drank her coffee. The morning light came through the kitchen window at its October angle lower than summer softer, the quality of light that makes everything it touches look considered and certain. The jacket was on the back of the chair. The patch was there with the others. Outside, the garden was winding down. The beans had been pulled. The tomato stakes stood bare in the cooling ground. The peony was mulched and patient deep in the work of roots storing energy for the long winter, preparing for the spring that was not yet visible but was already decided. She got up and washed her mug. She put on her jacket. She went out to do the work the morning required. She was 69 years old. She had a notebook in 30 years, and a town that knew her name, and a jacket that told the story of her life if you knew how to read it. She had work to do, which was the same as always, which was fine. She had always known what to do with a morning. You got up, you made your coffee, you stood at the window and looked at what needed tending, and then you went out and you tended it. She had been doing it for 30 years. She intended to do it for 30 more. The gate swung behind her. The October morning accepted her into it. The county road ran past the end of the driveway into the distance toward the rest of Millhaven, and the county, and the state, and all the ordinary human places where things needed tending, and people needed someone patient enough to help them tend. She had all of that ahead of her. She walked into the morning. Vance called that afternoon. He always called on the anniversary weekend, which was a thing they had both begun doing in the second year after Hank, and which neither of them had ever suggested stopping. He called and she answered, and they talked for a while about Hank, and about the chapter, and about the things that had happened since June, and about what was coming next. Vance talked about a new member who had come up through the right way, slowly earning his patch over 2 years. A young man from Knoxville who had come to the chapter with nothing but the right intentions, and had shown over those 2 years that intentions could be backed by character. Hank would have liked him, Vance said. He's a good one. She asked about the chapter's charity ride that was coming up in November. Vance gave her the numbers, which were good, the kind of numbers that came from years of building community trust and demonstrating consistently that when Iron Valley said they were going to do something, they did it. She knew most of those numbers intimately, had watched them grow from the modest early efforts when she and Hank were building something that didn't yet have a track record, into the substantial annual events they had become, events that filled accounts at the food bank and the Veterans Center and the Youth Mentorship Program, and that people in 3 counties marked on their calendars. "You coming to the ride?" Vance asked. "What time does it start?" 8. "I'll be there at 7:45, he laughed. "Thought so." After she got off the phone, she went out to the barn, which was the workshop. She kept it the way Hank had kept it, which was organized in a manner that made sense only to someone who understood how Hank thought about the relationship between tools and the work they did. Everything grouped not by type, but by application, so that what you needed for a specific job was all in one place rather than distributed across categories. It was, she had always thought, a philosophy as much as a filing system. You organize things around what they were for, not what they were. There was a bike that needed work. She had been doing this one for 2 months, not rushing it because it belonged to Robert Monroe's grandson, who had inherited it from a great-uncle, and who wanted it running again for reasons that were more about the great-uncle than about riding. The bike had been in good shape once and had sat too long and needed patient attention rather than speed. She had been giving it patient attention for 2 months, and it was getting close. She put on her work clothes and her work gloves, and she started where she had left off. The barn in October had the smell of cool metal and oil, and the dry quality of closed space, which was a smell she had known since her 20s, and that had always meant something like purpose to her. She worked through the afternoon in the quiet, competent way she worked, not rushing, checking her work, doing it right the first time, because there was no advantage to doing it wrong, and then doing it over. The bike responded the way machines respond to someone who knows them, with the small, incremental revelations of things coming into alignment. She thought about the great-uncle. She had never met him, but the condition of the bike, the care someone had once taken with it, told her things. Someone had loved this machine, had kept it right, had understood that a machine you maintain is a different thing from a machine you merely use. She thought about what it meant to receive something that had been cared for over a long time and to try to be worthy of that care. In the distance, through the open barn door, the afternoon was going toward evening. The October light was doing what October light does, which is to make everything it touches look deliberate, as though the world had arranged itself to be looked at carefully before the dark came. She could see the corner of the garden, the bare ground, the mulched peony, the stakes still standing from the tomatoes. Next spring, the particular faith of preparation. She worked until the light was too low to work well. Then she cleaned up, put the tools away in their right places, covered the bike. She would finish it next week. It would be ready. The grandson would have his great-uncle's bike running again, and he would ride it or not ride it according to his own sense of what to do with it. And either way, the machine would have been restored to what it could be, which was the thing that had been asked of her. She came inside. She washed her hands at the kitchen sink with the particular care of someone cleaning up after work that matters. She made dinner a simple thing, soup, from the last of the garden's yield that she had been making all week. The accumulated flavors of the season in one bowl. She ate at the kitchen table. She read for a while. She went to bed. In the morning, she got up and made coffee and stood at the kitchen window and looked at the garden. October. The bare ground and the standing stakes and the patient mulched root of the peony. Everything that had been growing was done for the year. Everything that was going to grow next year was already in its decisions about that below the surface, out of sight, working in the way that things work when they are getting ready. She thought about the woman on Pine Creek Road. She thought about Reed and the next steps in the Dalton proceedings. She thought about the charity ride and the food bank numbers. She thought about Knox's new mechanic and about Tyler, who was teaching school in the next county and who had driven 2 hours to be in that room on a Thursday in June. She thought about all of it as the coffee got ready and the morning light came through the window at its October angle. There was a notebook on the table. There was work to do. There were people who needed someone patient enough to show up. There was a town that had been her town for 30 years, and that would be her town for as long as she could manage it. There was a jacket on the back of the chair with 30 years on it, and a new patch sewn in properly, part of the whole, no longer new. She poured her coffee. She sat down. She opened the notebook to the next blank page, and she took the pen and she wrote at the top, in the matter-of-fact hand she had used all her life, Tuesday, Pine Creek Road. Then she sat with her coffee and looked at what the morning required and thought about how to meet it. There was no drama in this. There never had been much drama, not in the daily reality of it, the years of ordinary mornings that had preceded and followed the moments that people might later describe as the important ones. The important moments were real, but they were surrounded always by the vast, ordinary territory of the work itself. The long, unphotographed labor of caring for something over the long term. She had never needed the drama. She had needed the work, and she had needed the people, and she had needed the morning light through the kitchen window, and the coffee in her hands, and the knowledge that there was something to do today that mattered. Those were the things. They had always been enough. She took a sip of coffee. She looked at the garden. She thought about what she would say when she got to Pine Creek Road, how she would start the conversation, what the person needed to hear first before they were ready to hear the rest. She thought about the notebook and all the other notebooks before it, going back 20 years, filled now and stored in the cabinet in the spare bedroom, each one a record of a season of this work. She was 69 years old. The morning was clear. There was coffee. There was a notebook with a blank page in front of her and a pen in her hand and a list of things to do that were worth doing. There was a jacket on the back of the chair with 30 years in it and a new patch that Hank had arranged before he left, waiting to be given to her for the right moment. She was not done, not close to done. The work was not done, and the town was not done, and the people were not done, and she was not done. She had meant what she said to Paul Dalton that morning in June, not in anger and not in pride, but in the simple, declarative register of a woman who knows what she is and where she belongs. This was her town. These were her people. This had always been her town. She finished her coffee. She put on her jacket. She went out into the morning. The gate swung open and then closed behind her with the familiar sound it had made every morning for 30 years. The small domestic sound of a life in motion. A person going out to do what they went out to do. She walked into the October morning, and the morning accepted her, and she went on. The Tuesday came. She drove out to Pine Creek Road in the morning, past the fields going brown, and the tree lines turning the particular October drive through country that she had been driving for 30 years, and that still had, on mornings like this, the quality of something worth seeing. She found the house without trouble, small, set back from the road, a vegetable garden along the east wall that had been tended with care and was now being put to bed for winter, the particular neatness of someone who knows what they are doing with the ground. She knocked. A woman answered. 40-something, cautious in the specific way of someone who has been visited by people who did not have her interests at heart and who has not yet been given reason to believe the current visitor is different. She looked at Nora's jacket and at Nora's face in the October morning and said, "Are you from the sheriff's office?" "No," Nora said. "My name is Nora Holden. Reed Armstrong asked me to come. You called him last week." The woman looked at her for a moment. Then she opened the door and said, "I made coffee if you want some." She wanted some. Her name was Patricia. She had lived on this property for 12 years, bought it with her husband before the divorce, kept it after, raised her 2 kids here, kept the garden because the garden kept her, she said in the blunt way of someone who has found the words for a thing. She had been visited twice by a man with a clipboard who had explained certain things about the value of the land and certain opportunities she might wish to consider, and she had said she needed to think about it. And then the third visit had come, and the papers had been different from what she had expected, and she had signed one of them before fully understanding what it was. And then she had read it again, and then she had called the sheriff's office. Nora sat at the kitchen table and listened. She listened the way she always listened, which was entirely and without the particular restlessness of someone waiting for their turn to talk. She let Patricia find her own way through the story at the pace the story required. She drank the coffee, which was good. She looked at the kitchen, which was the kitchen of someone who lived carefully in the space they had, who made the space work through attention rather than means. When Patricia had said what she needed to say, Nora asked a few questions. Then she explained what she understood about the document Patricia had signed, what it did and didn't mean, legally what Patricia's options were, and who she should talk to next. She was not an attorney, she said so, but she had been doing this work long enough to understand the landscape, and she knew which attorney in the county specifically took property rights cases, and who would work on a contingency basis for people who could not pay up front. She wrote the name and number in the notebook. She tore out the page and gave it to Patricia. She told her what to say when she called. She told her what to bring. Patricia looked at the page for a moment. Then she looked at Nora. "Why are you doing this?" she said, not suspiciously, genuinely. Nora thought about how to answer that. She thought about the simple version of the answer, which was that she had been doing this kind of thing for 30 years, and she intended to keep doing it. She thought about the longer version, which involved Hank and Iron Valley, and a particular understanding of what it meant to belong to a place and to the people in it. She thought about the full version, which she had never said out loud to anyone, and which was probably not what Patricia needed to hear on a Tuesday morning with paperwork, anxiety, and a kitchen table between them. She said, "Because this is my county and you're my neighbor, that's enough." Patricia looked at her. She looked at the jacket, at the patches that meant things to people who knew how to read them. She nodded slowly, the nod of someone who is making an assessment and has reached a conclusion they trust. "All right," she said. They sat for another half hour. Patricia asked questions and Nora answered them. The coffee got replenished. The morning moved through the kitchen window in the long October light. Outside, the vegetable garden was patient in its bare ground, ready for its winter, storing what it needed to come back in spring. When Nora left, she sat in her truck for a moment at the end of the driveway, looking back at the house. The kitchen light was still on. Through the window, she could see Patricia at the table, looking at the page with the attorney's name on it. Looking at it the way a person looks at a thing that has changed the shape of a situation. A small piece of paper with a name and a number, the kind of thing that seems minor and is not minor at all because it is the difference between being alone with a problem and having somewhere to go with it. She backed out of the driveway and drove toward home. The county road ran east and west through the October landscape, past farms and stands of trees, and the occasional mailbox at the end of a gravel drive. Past the fields that had been planted and harvested and were now going to their winter rest. Past the ordinary geography of a place she had been moving through for 3 decades, and that she knew the way you know a thing you have paid steady attention to over a long time. Not just with your eyes, but with the accumulated sense of a life spent in a particular place. She drove without hurry. The morning was clear. The light on the hills was doing what October light does in Tennessee, which is something worth looking at if you have learned to look. She was thinking about the spring, about what the new season would require and what she would be ready for, about the garden and the work at the shop and the chapter's spring fundraiser and the dozen conversations that were already waiting in the notebook to be had, about the woman on Pine Creek Road and the attorney's name on the torn-out page, about the thing that had been set in motion in June, which was still moving through its various channels and would continue to move and would eventually arrive at whatever conclusions it arrived at, which would not be everything, but would be something, and something was what you worked for when everything was not available. She thought about Hank. She thought about the patch. She thought about the photograph on the back room wall of Carver's Diner, the two of them on their bikes, Hank grinning, her looking at something off to the right, with the expression she wore when something had caught her attention. She thought about what had caught her attention that day and realized she couldn't remember, which was fine because some things are preserved in photographs, not as specific memories, but as evidence of the general fact that you were there, that you were present for your own life, that you showed up. She had showed up. 30 years of showing up. She intended to keep showing up. She turned onto the county road that led home. The truck moved through the morning at the steady pace she kept, not rushing the way she had learned to move through most things. The gate at the end of her driveway came into sight, the house behind it, the bare garden and the waiting ground and the peony under its mulch, Deep in its root, work patient, preparing for something not yet visible. She pulled in. She turned off the engine. She sat for a moment with her hands in her lap, in the quiet of the truck cab, and looked at the house where she had lived for 27 years, and where she intended to live for as many more as she was given. The morning was entirely ordinary. There was nothing momentous about it. She was a woman coming home on a Tuesday after an hour-long conversation at a kitchen table, having given someone a name, a number on a piece of paper. That was all it was. It was also the thing she had been doing all her life in every version of itself, in every season and circumstance. The patient work, the listening, the slow accumulation of small, true things, the trust that this was how you held a community together. Not through the dramatic moments, though those came, but through the 10,000 ordinary ones, the Tuesday drives, and the kitchen tables, and the cups of coffee, and the careful attention paid to the people around you over the long, unglamorous term. She got out of the truck. She put on her jacket. She felt the patches under her hands as she settled it over her shoulders, the familiar weight of 30 years. And in her pocket, the sewn-in solidarity of the new patch that had been waiting for her since before she knew it was waiting. She went inside. She hung the jacket on the back of the chair. She made coffee. She stood at the window and looked at the garden. There was a notebook open on the table and pages to fill, and a week's worth of work ahead of her that would not announce itself in any newspaper and would not be remembered in any particular ceremony and would matter enormously to the specific people it touched, which was always how it had been and was exactly how she intended to keep it. She poured her coffee. She sat down. She picked up the pen. She began.